Hello, my name is Jackson Spargur, and I'm here to talk through my senior orchestra piece, Polaris, which was premiered by the Bard Conservatory Orchestra in December of 2019. So I'm going to be walking through some of the more important ideas and how I put together some of what I see as the more important moments in the piece. So let's start with the name, Polaris. So I came up with the name when I was most of the way through writing the piece, and it came out of this idea that I had kind of started to think about with polarity, which kind of runs throughout the piece. And sometimes I begin a piece with a master plan, or some kind of plan, but that wasn't the case with this piece. I knew that I wanted to kind of feature the bass instruments, including obviously the double basses and the strings. I knew I wanted the contrabassoon, and I wanted to feature the contrabassoon. I knew I wanted saxophones, alto, tenor, bari sax, and I knew I wanted to have an electric bass in there too, and then obviously the low brass as well. So I knew that I wanted it to be like a very kind of thick, bass heavy sort of texture, and also just it includes some instruments that aren't often included in the orchestra, like the saxophones, and I put a drum set in there. So yeah, that was mostly what I had in mind in terms of like an overarching kind of plan for the piece. But other than that, I went into it just from the beginning. I just tried to come up with a main theme for the piece, like a melody to begin the piece, and I decided to begin it in the basses, just a double bass section solo. So I'll play what I came up with, just the first couple bars. So already in the first two notes of the piece, we kind of already have this theme of polarity at work. Although again, this idea of polarity was not on my mind when I wrote the notes. I just kind of started writing. But here they are. So that's a descending tritone, and the thing about notes that tritone apart is that they actually sit on opposite ends of the circle of fifths. So this is kind of where I started to think about this polarity idea much later, when I was kind of looking back on the piece. So they kind of sit at opposite ends or opposite poles of the circle of fifths was my idea. So I started to think about the piece in terms of this idea of harmonic polarity. And in this opening theme, the tritone is sort of at the forefront. We start off with this descending tritone, and then there isn't a tritone for a little bit. We go, and then there's another descending tritone, and then we kind of resolve on this B flat. That's where it sits for a second. While it's sitting on that B, we get this kind of nice sense of resolution with that. It's there's this quiet third harmonization in the cellos and in the bass clarinet, and it kind of rests on that B flat for a while, and it sounds nice and sort of settled. But then the idea of polarity is developed a little bit more, because while we have this major third from the B flat to the D, implying this kind of B flat major, there's a disturbance. The piano comes in with an E major triad, which is actually, it's a triad, a tritone apart from the B flat triad, or implied triad, just the 1 and the 3. So instead of it now just being a tritone that's kind of defining this polarity, and instead of it just being like a melodic polarity, now we have like a tonal polarity. We have triads now, a tritone apart, instead of just notes, a tritone apart. So let's listen to where it goes from there. So here's where I actually want to talk about another facet of this polarity thing. So there's the polarity of the tritone interval and the melody, and then we have the kind of chordal polarity of the two major triads, a tritone apart, superimposed. But at a certain point, that kind of starts to become, in itself, a sound. It starts to become a little bit homogeneous, and it in itself kind of needs a contrast. You can't just sit on that forever. So at a certain point, I started to think about all of the harmonies, and this happened sort of early on. This was before I started analyzing everything and thinking about polarity. This was kind of more an instinctual thing early on. I started to think about all the harmonies in the piece as belonging to one of two worlds. One of them was this sort of superimposed tritone apart triad sound, which some of you might actually recognize as in reality being an octatonic sound. And that's because two major triads, a tritone apart, actually outline a half-whole octatonic scale, just missing the 3rd and the 7th scale degree. Some other people among you might recognize it as being a Lydian dominant sound, just missing the 2nd and the 6th scale degrees, which is also true. And maybe a little bit more true in this case, as I actually discovered the sound not through messing around with the octatonic scale, but actually more through the jazz idea that if you have two dominant functioning triads, a tritone apart, they're actually in some way sort of equivalent. They can be used interchangeably, which is one of the cool things about harmony to me, is that you can kind of arrive at the same conclusions so many different ways. But now onto this other world I was talking about. So I needed to create something to contrast with this kind of octatonic thing, and because it's sort of a mean, kind of mysterious thing, I decided to go for something just totally wide open and bright and kind of pleasant sounding. And where better to turn for that than like a Lydian sound, like a fifths, stacked fifths sort of thing. This was an idea which I think I first saw really articulated by Jacob Collier. It's basically just the idea that there's sort of a logical continuation of Lydian. So Lydian, the thing that the thing that's most kind of apparent about it is that there's a sharp 4. It's a major scale with a sharp 4, which just kind of makes it sound even more bright. And the cool thing about it is you can actually make a Lydian scale by just stacking fifths on top of each other. Say we start from C. If you go up a fifth from C, you get G. You add a fifth to G, and you get a D, which is the 2 or the 9. And then you add a fifth to D, you get A, which is the major 6th or the 13th. If you add a fifth to A, you get E, which is the major 3rd. You add a fifth to E, you get B, which is the major 7th. You add a fifth to B, you get F sharp. Now you have the sharp 4, and you also have every single note in the C Lydian scale. So the idea is if you're able to build the Lydian scale just by stacking fifths, you should be able to kind of go almost like further into Lydian by just stacking more fifths. So for example, you stack one more fifth on top of F sharp and you get C sharp, which is, you know, some would say, oh, it's a flat 9, but it can't be the flat 9 because you already have a natural 9. It would just be sort of weird to think about it in like a scale sense that way. So you can call it the sharp 15. That's what Jacob Collier does, and he probably got it from somewhere else. But yeah, so and you can keep going from this sharp 15. You can, you know, you start to get kind of weirder and weirder sounds, but theoretically, you know, you could have a 12-note chord, and if you voiced it really well, it would sound, you know, it would sound just like super, super Lydian. You'd have to really do a lot of work to set it up that way and not make it sound like a mess. But I found that the sharp 15, you know, some might think it weird, like a Lydian sound with a flat 9, but actually I've found it to be really usable. And if you do it right, it can be a really nice sound, just kind of one step further into that Lydian world. And it just kind of gives you like this spectrum from like open and warm, you know, if you've only stacked a couple of fifths, you know, and then you keep stacking fifth, and it just takes you like further and further down the Lydian rabbit hole into like this strange and otherworldly kind of textures. Then of course the other thing is that stacking fifths, what implies that there's a whole other side to things, stacking fourths, which takes you into the Locrian, which of course is the darkest of the modes. But that's a whole other thing, which I'm not going to get into. With this octatonic and with the Lydian world, we already have two contrasting sorts of sounds that I can play off each other. So that's very early on what I decided to go with. And I bring it up because that's exactly what happens. That's exactly what happens in that last excerpt. So the basses reassert themselves on that low E, which is descending tritone again. And then they kind of continue from there. The cellos enter, still in this kind of dark octatonic-y world. And then as the other instruments enter, you can kind of hear the tension start to melt away a little bit. And then maybe it sort of closes in one last time, but then it all kind of is finally resolved on this big open C Lydian sort of thing. So I know that I talked in a lot of detail in this part. I mainly just wanted to convey that you can kind of see the kernel of a lot of the main important ideas of the piece contained within this this opening section. So now I'm gonna jump forward in the piece a bit, and I'm gonna touch on some sections that sort of have a continuous mounting tension. Something I enjoy doing a lot in music, or at least trying to do, is develop sections that sort of have like a shepherd tone quality to them harmonically. A shepherd tone, for those who don't know, is kind of an auditory illusion. It's a special tone you can make that sort of sounds like it just keeps rising and rising and rising and rising, even though in actuality it never changes at all. So that's kind of what I like to go for. I like it when changes of harmony sort of sound inevitable, like they're always like landing just where they're supposed to be landing. It's not like coming out of left field. There's sort of this like inevitable kind of, there's almost a resolution with everyone. And yet at the same time, with every change, it's like things just become more and more and more and more tense. So I just like to show one fairly short example of this from sort of like the early middle of my piece and kind of walk through how it's working. So we start off in like a purely whole tone moment rooted on E, and then we move to this like kind of really thick, crunchy C Lydian altered dominant thing. I found that if you set up the foundation of your voicing well enough, you kind of have a lot of freedom in the upper structures. I didn't go like too crazy here, but I just kind of stacked fourths, which is kind of a cool sound, especially in the upper winds. They can kind of almost sound like overtones. The key to a lot of kind of good moves, a lot of like cool little shifts, I found, is having enough notes stay the same, and then having just a select few move, often like in half step increments. So for example, here between the E and the C, we have C in common, we have F sharp, D, E, A flat, and B. Those are all in common, so the only new notes are G and E flat. But even just these have enough of an effectiveness to tell us that something's changed. Plus of course the changing bass is huge. So after the C, we change to F, which is, in this case, another big crunchy chord, another F, Lydian dominant, this time with a sharp 5. Sometimes I try to engineer root movement, and sometimes I just try to follow my ear. This is actually one of the cases where I wanted to have almost the feeling of like a bluesy 1/7 to 4/7, which is in this case what's going on C to F. So the great thing about that movement in particular, I think, is that it sets up a really strong expectation in our minds of what's going to happen next, which just makes it that much easier to subvert that expectation. In this case, what happens is the F7, instead of going back to C or going on to G, which would be the 5, or what have you, it just sort of melts away. And it's almost as if it melts away to reveal underneath this little saxophone section, which is in this case outlining extensions of a B altered dominant sound. And that's backed up by a switch in the electric bass from F to B. Although, of course, those notes are a tritone apart, F and B, which means that the notes above this little saxophone section, what's great about that is they actually work over either bass note, either over F or B, just the same. And that comprises the final shift, because the next section sort of begins on this B Lydian dominant sound. Yeah. So now it's time to jump way ahead in the piece and cover another sort of like tension mounting section, this time with a more rhythmic focus. So about a third of the way through writing the piece, I started to get the idea for this ostinato theme, which would sort of be birthed from the prior themes of the piece, and kind of come naturally out of it, and then just gradually take over, and the whole rest of the piece would kind of be based on this thing. So I just kind of waited on it, just waiting for the right time to put it in, and then finally about 2/3 of the way through the piece, I found the right time, and this is what starts to take over. Over and over again. And like throughout the whole piece prior to this, there's a lot of repetition of little sort of melodic nuggets that I think kind of bridge the gap between the original theme, and this, and the idea was that it would be kind of like a natural thing where you kind of got to see, you got to see this original theme kind of evolve over time very clearly into this ostinato, so that it did kind of feel inevitable. But the thing is, I feel like that actually turned out to be one of the biggest problems with the piece, is that I don't think in the end I did do that very effectively. So I don't know that I totally succeeded in that, actually. I wanted it to be really clear and effective, and very kind of well developed. And I'm not sure that it was that, but that was the idea. And you will notice at least that there's kind of a similar contour, kind of like this snaking up and down sort of thing to them both. It doesn't have any tritones in it, but it is definitely still based around this Lydian dominant idea, in this case an E Lydian dominant thing. The only problem is this C natural. That's not in the E Lydian dominant. So there's one note out, and I mean, if you wanted to kind of justify it, you could think of it as maybe being borrowed from E minor, or you could actually think of it, and this actually might be a better way to think about it. You could think about it as being borrowed from B flat, which is the scale, or it's the root, a tritone away from E. So you could think of it as being actually the 2 in the B flat Lydian dominant scale, which I think actually works very well, because if you do think about it like that, and of course that's the whole idea with this sort of Lydian dominant thing, is that we can have 2 keys, a tritone apart, going on at once. If you do think about it like that, it's the same thing, where in B flat, this ostinato also has 1 note out of the scale, in this case the B natural. That's probably the best way to think about it, because it works just as well in both cases. So anyway, I'll play the passage that sort of leads into and develops this ostinato. So you can see that what I decided to do with this section was kind of make it into a little bit more than just an ostinato. I mean, I really kind of put the bass and the percussion, the drum set to work, and it turns into a little bit of a groove, almost more than anything else, like a riff and a groove. And what I tried to go for was something that was, a little bit nasty, because this already has, these kind of wonky accents in it. So I sort of tried to play off that a bit. So you can see there's a little bit of trickery in here. It all fits in 4/4, but it sort of has to squash itself in there, because the first little cell is in a group of 5 or a group of 2+3. And the next you get a group of 4, and then the group of 5 again. And by that point, there's only half a beat left. So the last cell is 2 16th notes, and the whole thing starts again. So it's in 4/4, but if you're just listening to it with no frame of reference, you're sort of left wondering. It starts off clearly in a 2+3 5, then you get a 4, and it begins again after, so it's a 9, but this time the second half is cut short to a 2, so it's not that either. It's supposed to be disorienting. Now let's look at what the bass and kick and snare are doing. So you can see first off that the bass and kick and snare are doing the same thing on both halves of the bar, while the melodic figure is asymmetrical. That's going to sound weird already, because it starts out 5 16ths plus 4 16ths. It's going to be displaced back by 1 16th note relative to this steady backbeat thing that the bass and snare and kick are doing. And to be clear, it absolutely is like a rock backbeat sort of feel. It's, dum, 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 except for it's really slow, which already is sort of weird because there's so much open space there, dum, dum. But I try to take advantage of that space, because you'll notice here that that the snare doesn't come in on beats 2 and 4 like a normal backbeat, but on the second 16th note of beats 2 and 4. That does a couple things. First, I think it stretches out the time all that much more. So it's already a slow backbeat, and that extra 16th note delay doesn't necessarily hit as a 16th note delay. It's more like laying back on the beat. It almost gives it that kind of flammy D'Angelo thing where everything is just sitting like a little bit out of whack, but in a way that kind of sounds good. But of course, it's not laying back at all because there's this constant 16th note ostinato thing going on underneath. So it has to be locked into that. And that cross stick actually falls on the third accent of the ostinato. And what that does, I think, is it establishes a quintuplet subdivision of the beat, which is actually a really common thing in certain kinds of music, especially kind of recently. And relating to this sort of D'Angelo thing, breaking up the beat into 5 parts to sort of have this like, it kind of gives you that like laid back feeling, but in sort of like a structured way. Obviously, in my case, the illusion that we're in this like, quintuplet swing neo soul thing is shattered as soon as as the cello 4 comes in, and the whole thing repeats. But I think it does create that effect for just a brief moment, and then because we are in 4/4 and there's this 4 after the 5, and that displaces the figure on the beat a little bit, that kind of throws things off for the remainder of the bar. And you're kind of almost never given a chance to quite catch up with what's happening until you get to the very end and then it restarts. That's how I built that groove, which I wanted to go over because it does play such a big part in the latter half of the piece. Now we're going to move on to almost the ending, to this sort of string interlude thing, which kind of ties up some of the harmonic ideas that I started developing more towards the beginning of the piece. Okay, so we eventually reach this huge climax, kind of on the back of the ostinato thing, and then everything suddenly cuts out, gets super quiet. It's just the cellos and the basses. They come back in quoting the main theme from the beginning, and then going into this like recitativo thing, kind of like very reminiscent of the 4th movement of Beethoven's Ninth, and then after a while of that, we get this sort of string interlude with just the strings and all of the strings, and it's kind of this harmonic thing, which I think kind of it sort of becomes the crux of the piece to me a little bit, just with how it just like in such a focused way kind of addresses and ties up this idea of polarity, which I kind of been developing for the whole piece. And then as it continues, eventually it kind of grows into a little mini climax of its own, which is on a lesser scale, but it's kind of the last word of the piece. And after that's kind of dealt with, then things kind of resolve once and for all, and then just sort of fade into stillness and peace, and that's the end. So let's listen to it. So yeah, we've already kind of had the main big dramatic climax. But I think this one in a way is almost a little bit more important. It's like the stakes almost seem a little bit higher here because we've come all this way, but there's still a little bit more left to be said. There are some kind of demons that haven't quite been dealt with yet. Something that needs to be sort of gotten through before we can reach like the final resolution that the piece has been looking for. I think to me a big part of what's selling that lingering tension is the low B pedal here in the bass that's happening throughout this interlude. There's some moments of warmth and of beauty and of even almost like a sort of triumphant moment, but all the while it's like you can't really escape that there's this kind of unsettling feeling underneath it all, which I think is what the B, often clashing with what's going on above, is bringing to the table there. This all comes back to tritones, obviously. So what's going on is in the upper strings, they're constantly moving back and forth between sort of a B and an F world, kind of just oscillating back and forth between those. So in this first chord here, which is in the B world, we have the major third in the violas, the minor seventh in the first violins, and then an F in the second violins, which is really, you can think of it as E sharp, which would be the sharp 4. Then on the third beat, we change, and now we're in an F world, although only one note has actually changed. The F is now the root, the A is a major third, and the D sharp moves down to a C natural, now the 5th, although it could have actually stayed and played the role of the minor 7th. Anyway, this continues back and forth. Finally, on bar 175, we land on this chord, and to me, it's a chord just kind of dripping with unresolved angst. It's in the F world with a D sharp or E flat in the cellos, so it's not only tense intrinsically, but also tense in its position with a foot in two tonalities at once, with that B pedal still kind of lurking at the bottom. And then, one by one, instruments begin to join, starting with the contrabassoon on a B, even an octave lower than the basses. And then there's just this big swell. And to improve the clarity of these two kind of tonalities going on at once, I did a couple things. One of them was I had instruments kind of enter in groups, each in their own sort of like viable voicing. So for instance, the horns all enter at once on this F sound. I have the strings all switch to this big kind of more open F voicing instead of like the more ambiguous kind of mixture of the two. And then the other thing going on is that I really don't have any instruments in the B world. It's all just these super low bass instruments coming in actually on the B itself at the bottom, nothing on the F sharp or the D flat. And I think I did that just because I didn't really need to have literally like a B triad and an F triad. I've kind of sold that already at this point with what's happened before. And I think with this bigger texture, it kind of muddied the waters in maybe a bad way. And I think what I ended up settling on with this kind of very fleshed out open F voicing with just a ton of instruments on the B underneath actually kind of sells it better. And now comes really the last shift of the piece, is that D sharp of, as the third of the B finally does enter, but as an E flat. So there's another sort of melt moment. A group of winds enters quietly, and slowly becomes more and more present until they take over the sound. They're sort of exposed slowly, as if they were underneath this bigger sound the whole time. What's happening is they're voiced in like a sort of F sus dominant thing, like an E flat triad over F. And that means that the only unfamiliar note here, the only new note here, is B flat. So that's it's just this tiny little shift you can hear. The G was already there as part of this kind of open F voicing. The E flat works with B major, doesn't sound alien. So yeah, I think it's an effective shift here because it's such a different sound, this sort of calm, unemotional sus voicing with this like very prominently voiced E flat major triad. which sounds very different from like F and B. And yet because the root and the bass of this is F, it also sounds totally natural, like it was there all along within this, angsty semi-bitonality. And it almost, in a way, it kind of was there all along. So anyway, the piece ends not too much later, kind of just floating into nothingness on this sort of F sus thing. One of the teachers who I worked with on this Susan body actually taught me this really cool trick. The end of the piece, I have this sort of dark cymbal played with soft mallets kind of going on. You can almost like, if you're not looking for it, you'd almost barely notice it's there. It's so quiet. And it's sort of happening as the winds are holding these final notes of the piece. What's going on is that the cymbal hangs a little bit longer, and you can't hear as well the winds as they finally, the moment that they kind of stop blowing. That sound, which might have been sort of abrupt, is kind of masked by this cymbal going on underneath everything else. So it's kind of like, it's almost like a little bit of white noise, just sort of blurring the line between note and no note in a way. So that was something really effective that I kind of learned along the way. But yeah, that's how the piece ends. I hope this was informative or interesting in some way. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to hear the piece, you can hear it at my Bandcamp, which I'll put a link to it up on the screen. And then you can hear that and a lot of my other stuff, a lot of my other projects on my website, jacksonspargur.com. I'll put a link up to that as well. So yeah, that's it. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks again.